Everything this family has, the house, the reputation, the name that came from my side. Audrey hasn't contributed a single thing that couldn't have been done by anyone off the street. Daniel Mercer said it at his own dinner table, with his brother watching from across the room and his mother nodding slowly beside him, and his wife sitting 3 feet away with a glass of water halfway to her lips. She set the glass down. She didn't spill it. She didn't slam it. She set it down the way you set something down when you've decided, very quietly, that it's the last time you'll be holding it. Her name was Audrey Sinclair Mercer. Audrey Sinclair before she married him, and she had never once stopped being Audrey Sinclair, even when she signed her name with his. She was 38 years old, she wore her dark hair pulled back without fuss, and she had a way of listening to people that made them feel heard without giving anything away herself. That quality, which Daniel had always called reserved, was actually something closer to strategic. Audrey Sinclair Mercer had learned a long time ago that the most powerful position in any room was the one nobody was watching. She had met Daniel 11 years ago at a fundraising dinner for a children's hospital in Ottawa. He was charming, certain of himself in the way that people who've never been told no tend to be. And he had a laugh that filled up whatever room he was in. She had liked him immediately and trusted him slowly, which in retrospect was the right order. They married 3 years later in a ceremony at a converted heritage barn outside of Kingston. His family sat on one side, hers sat on the other. His mother, Vivian Mercer, had looked at Audrey's side of the aisle and said, very pleasantly, such a small gathering, how intimate. Audrey's father had squeezed her hand. That woman, he'd said quietly, is going to be a project. He wasn't wrong. For 8 years, Audrey had managed the household and, in the way that never appeared on any org chart, managed the Mercer family's public presence as well. Daniel ran Mercer Capital Advisors, the investment firm his grandfather had founded, and his father had grown, and which Daniel had, by all visible accounts, inherited and continued. He was good at the front of it. He knew how to walk into a room. He knew which wines to order and which questions to ask and how to make men 15 years, his senior, feel like the most important person he'd spoken to all week. What he was less good at, and this was the part that appeared nowhere in any profile or feature piece or industry award, was the infrastructure underneath all of that. The infrastructure was Audrey. She had started quietly, the way she did everything. In the first year of their marriage, she had noticed that Daniel's assistant was scheduling client dinners without accounting for the professional relationships between attendees. Putting 2 partners from competing funds at the same table, that sort of thing. Audrey had mentioned it once. Daniel had nodded and done nothing, so she had taken it upon herself to do a quiet review of the guest lists before they went out. Nobody asked her to. Nobody thanked her. She simply made sure the right people sat near the right people, and the dinners went well, and Daniel looked good, and she moved on. Then it was the firm's annual report. She had picked it up from his desk one evening and read through it while he was on a call, and she had found 3 factual inconsistencies in the opening letter, the kind that wouldn't be caught by a proofreader but would be caught immediately by any sophisticated investor who'd been following the fund for more than 2 years. She fixed them, rewrote the letter, left it on his desk without a note. He submitted it the next morning, received compliments on the writing, and assumed it had been cleaned up by the communications team. It wasn't. There was no communications team. There was Audrey, in the kitchen at 10:30 at night with a glass of tea and a copy of last year's report open beside her for comparison. Over 8 years, the quiet work accumulated. She had restructured how the firm's quarterly updates were distributed to clients, after noticing that the timing was creating anxiety rather than confidence. She had identified a mid-level associate who was skimming expense accounts. Not dramatically, but consistently, and left the documentation on Daniel's desk with a post-it note that said FYI. She had coached Daniel before 3 separate pitches that had each resulted in significant new capital commitments, sitting across from him at the kitchen table the night before, asking the hard questions the clients would ask until he had assured answers. She had maintained relationships with 4 of the firm's longest-standing clients, simply by being a gracious and attentive presence at the dinners and events she organized. Because those clients' wives liked her, and their wives influenced more than Daniel ever understood. She never invoiced for any of it. She never asked for credit. She had her own work. She consulted quietly for 2 nonprofits on governance and strategic communications, work she found deeply satisfying and which paid her a respectable income that she kept in her own accounts. It was enough. She didn't need to be seen inside Daniel's world. She was content to be the reason things worked. The dinner where Daniel made his speech was a Saturday in October. His brother Spencer had come from Vancouver with his girlfriend, and Daniel's mother had driven in from Oakville, and they had all sat around the dining table that Audrey had set with the autumn centerpiece she'd arranged herself from things she'd picked up at the farmer's market that morning. The conversation had turned, as it often did when Vivian was present, to the Mercer family legacy. Daniel had been talking about a new fund structure he was launching, and Vivienne had been exclaiming over how proud his grandfather would have been. And Spencer had asked a fairly reasonable question about how Audrey was spending her time these days. It was a neutral question. The kind of question people ask at family dinners. Daniel had answered it. Audrey keeps the house nice, he said, gesturing with his fork in a way that was probably meant to be inclusive but landed as dismissive. She has her little charity work. But honestly, everything this family has, the house, the reputation, the name, that came from my side. Audrey hasn't contributed a single thing that couldn't have been done by anyone off the street. Spencer looked at his plate. The girlfriend, whose name was Tessa, looked at the centerpiece. Vivienne smiled, and Audrey set her water glass down. She had a choice in that moment, and she understood the choice clearly, because Audrey Sinclair Mercer had always been very clear-eyed about the choices in front of her. She could say something. She had enough material to take that dinner table apart sentence by sentence. She could enumerate, calmly and with specificity, the 11 instances in the past 18 months alone where her behind-the-scenes work had directly prevented a client relationship from fraying, or a public embarrassment from landing, or a decision from going sideways. She could do that. She decided not to. Not because she was afraid and not because she doubted herself. She decided not to because she had learned something important over 8 years of watching Daniel Mercer in his natural habitat. He didn't hear things that were told to him. He only understood things that happened to him. So she smiled and she picked up her fork and she said, "More wine, Spencer?" And the dinner continued. That night she lay in the dark for a long time after Daniel fell asleep, and she thought very carefully. Not about whether to do something but about what, exactly, to do. By morning she had decided. She simply stopped. Not dramatically. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no letter left on the counter. Audrey just quietly ceased doing the things that nobody knew she was doing. She did not review the guest list for the Whitmore Capital dinner 3 weeks out. She did not cross-reference it against the attendee list from the Thompson and Gale holiday event 2 years prior, where 2 of the invited guests had had a very public professional falling out. She simply left the list as Daniel's assistant had assembled it and said nothing. She did not edit the Q4 client letter, which landed in her inbox by accident, a misdirect from Daniel's assistant, who'd been ceasing her on communications for so long it had become habit. She forwarded it to Daniel without comment and did not open it again. She did not remind him about the call with Raymond O.C. Darko, the Lagos-based fund of funds manager whose relationship with Mercer Capital was lucrative, and also, Audrey knew, contingent on a particular kind of attentiveness that Daniel was not naturally inclined toward. Raymond liked to be checked in on. Not asked for anything, just checked in on. Audrey had been sending him brief, warm emails every 6 weeks for 4 years. "Hope the quarter has been good to you, Raymond. We were thinking of you after the announcement last week." And Raymond had, on 3 separate occasions, told Daniel that the firm had a certain class that he didn't see everywhere. She stopped sending the emails. She said nothing to Daniel about any of it. She went about her days. She had her consulting work. She went to yoga on Tuesday mornings and met her friend Kathleen for coffee on Thursdays and drove her mother to her cardiology appointments in Mississauga on the first Friday of every month. She was not unhappy. She was, if anything, slightly curious. She wanted to see what the building looked like without the scaffolding. The first thing she noticed was that Daniel came home from the Whitmore Capital dinner slightly quieter than usual. She didn't ask. He'd poured himself a scotch and sat in the armchair in the living room for a while before coming to bed. And in the morning, when she asked conversationally how the evening had gone, he said, "Fine, good. The food was excellent." And she knew from the way he said excellent, with a slight emphasis, as though precision about the food was compensation for something else, that the evening had not, in fact, been excellent. She found out later, through Kathleen, whose husband worked in the same building as one of the Whitmore partners, that Daniel had seated Robert Fenwick and Murray Ashworth at the same table. Robert Fenwick and Murray Ashworth had been locked in an arbitration dispute for 16 months. The dinner had been extremely uncomfortable. Daniel had not known, his assistant had not known. The only person in Daniel's world who had known was Audrey, and Audrey had not said anything. She made a note of it. 3 weeks after that, the Q4 client letter went out. Within 48 hours, Daniel's assistant, a capable young woman named Brenna who Audrey had always liked, forwarded Audrey a chain of emails without comment. 3 clients had written back with pointed questions about performance figures that didn't align with what they'd been told the previous year. One of them, a retired physician named Dr. Harjit Dhaliwal, who had been with the firm for 9 years, had written in language that was polite in form and alarmed in substance. Audrey read the emails. She forwarded them back to Brenna with the note, "I think Daniel should handle these directly." And then she went back to what she was doing. Daniel handled them. It took him 2 days and a call with his compliance officer and a follow-up letter that, According to Brenna, he had rewritten 4 times. It resolved. But it cost him. Not money, time, sleep, the particular kind of confidence that comes from things going smoothly and being taken for granted. Raymond O.C. Darko went quiet in November. Daniel noticed by December. When Raymond declined a year-end call without explanation, Daniel called him directly. Raymond was pleasant and brief, and said he was very busy and would be in touch in the new year. Daniel hung up and stood in the kitchen doorway looking uncertain, in a way that Audrey had not seen on him in a long time. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Raymond's being weird," Daniel said. Said Audrey and went back to her book. By January, 3 things had happened that individually would have been manageable and together were starting to form a shape that Daniel could not quite name. One of the long-standing clients, the wife of a senior partner at a Bay Street firm, a woman named Cecilia Fontaine who had invested her personal inheritance through Mercer Capital for 6 years and had always been warm to Daniel at events, had shifted half her assets to another manager. When Daniel's assistant called to inquire, Cecilia's own assistant said only that Ms. Fontaine was restructuring her portfolio. The second thing was that a new business pitch, one Daniel had been confident about, a family office in Calgary that had been referred by one of the Whitmore partners, had gone quiet after a promising first meeting. Daniel had followed up twice. The third follow-up got a polite pass. The third thing was smaller, more personal, and somehow worse. Daniel had been nominated for a minor industry recognition, a regional investment community award, the kind that circulated within a specific professional world and meant something inside that world. He had won it twice before, both times in years when Audrey had spent several evenings helping him articulate his investment philosophy and community contributions clearly enough to make a compelling submission. This year, he had prepared the submission himself. He hadn't asked her, and she hadn't offered. He didn't win. He came home from the event with the particular tightness around his jaw that meant he was containing something. He didn't say anything that night. He said something 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning when they were both in the kitchen and the house was quiet. He had been looking at his laptop and then he closed it, and he looked at her in a way she didn't immediately recognize. Not with frustration, but with something more like bewilderment. "Did you used to do things?" he asked. "For the firm. I mean, behind the scenes." Audrey looked up from her coffee. "What makes you ask?" "Because things keep going, not catastrophically wrong. Just slightly off, in ways I can't trace. And I've been going back through the last few years trying to understand what's different, and the only variable I can identify is..." He stopped. He looked down at the closed laptop. "You." She let that sit for a moment. "You told your family I hadn't contributed a single thing that couldn't be done by anyone off the street," she said. Not with heat, very evenly. He was quiet. "That was..." He started and stopped. "I didn't mean it the way it came out." "How did you mean it?" He didn't have an answer for that. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally said. "Any of it. If you were doing all of this behind the scenes, why didn't you ever say so?" "I would have." "Would have what?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. "Daniel," she said, "I want you to think very carefully about that sentence before you finish it. Because whatever comes after 'I would have' is the most important thing you've said in this conversation." He thought about it for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a snowplow was working its way down the street. "I would have known," he finally said, quietly, without the performance. "I would have known what you were doing, and I would have probably taken it for granted anyway, at least for a while, because I didn't know how to see it." She looked at him. That was the most honest thing he'd said in 11 years of knowing her, and they both understood it. "I'm not interested in going back to invisible," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry. I'm past angry, actually. I think I've been past angry for a while now. But I am absolutely clear that I am not going back to doing things that never get named or acknowledged or factored into any equation." "Okay," he said. "I mean it. I know you mean it." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to try to be the kind of person who deserves that. I don't think I have been. I don't think I understood how much I wasn't." She considered him for a long moment. "This was the part that nobody ever warned you about, that when someone finally sees you, really sees you, it's disorienting. You've spent so long preparing for the fight that the absence of a fight feels strange, almost suspicious." But she had always been good at reading rooms, and the room she was reading now was a man who was genuinely dismantled, not performing remorse, actually dismantled. "I'm going to keep my consulting work," she said. "And I want it acknowledged properly as work. Not charity projects. Yes, and if I am ever going to put my time and expertise into supporting this firm, which I am not committing to, I'm leaving that as a question. It will be as a named contributor. I'll be on documentation. I'll be in conversations. I won't be in the kitchen at 11 at night fixing things that you get credit for." "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair, and what you said in October at dinner in front of your family, I know, you're going to correct it, not vaguely. You're going to tell your mother and Spencer what I've actually been doing. Specifically." He flinched slightly at that. The specific accountability was harder than the general apology she knew, but he nodded. I'll call Spencer this week, he said. And I'll talk to my mother. I'll be there when you talk to your mother. A brief pause. Yes. Okay. She looked at him for another moment and then she picked up her coffee and she said, I'm going to go for a walk. There's soup in the fridge from last night. She put on her coat and her boots and she walked out into the cold January morning, and the snow was bright and crisp underfoot, and she walked for a long time without thinking about very much at all, just breathing the cold air and feeling the particular clarity that comes after a very long period of patience has finally, quietly, concluded. 3 weeks later, Daniel called Spencer from the living room while Audrey was in the next room. She hadn't asked him to do it. She hadn't reminded him. He simply did it because they had spoken. It understood something, and this was the first evidence that the understanding was real and not just stated. She heard him explain to Spencer what Audrey had actually been doing for the firm for the better part of a decade. He was specific. He named things. He said the word contribution without wincing, and he said I didn't see it clearly without qualifying it away. And Spencer, to his credit, said, yeah, Danny, honestly, I always figured she was doing more than you were giving her credit for. The conversation with Vivienne was harder, and Audrey was there for it. Vivienne Mercer had a way of receiving corrections that was not quite resistance and not quite acceptance, more of a studied neutrality that said she was revising her position internally while maintaining deniability. She listened to Daniel. She looked at Audrey once or twice. She said, well, I didn't realize, which was the most Vivienne would likely ever say, and Audrey decided that for now it was sufficient. What mattered was that it was said. Raymond Darko responded to Daniel's January email in early February with more warmth than he'd shown in 3 months. Daniel didn't know why the temperature had shifted. Audrey had sent Raymond a brief, genuine note in late January, not on Daniel's behalf, just from herself, saying she'd been thinking of him, hoping the new year was starting well. Raymond had responded within the hour. They'd exchanged 3 messages. In his last one, he'd mentioned that he was hoping to make it to Toronto in the spring, and that he'd love to have dinner if they were free. She told Daniel. She gave him the information directly, no longer tucking it away. Raymond's coming in May. He'd like to have dinner. You should reach out to him directly and lock it in. Daniel looked at her with something that had not been in his eyes before. A tension of a different quality, the kind that comes from knowing you are looking at something you previously didn't look at carefully enough. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said. It was not a Audrey had no interest in transformation narratives, because she was practical and she understood that people change slowly and imperfectly and in fits and starts, and expecting otherwise was how people set themselves up for disappointment. What it was instead was a shift, a recalibration, the beginning of something that could, with continued effort from both of them, become a different kind of marriage than the one they'd been living in without quite realizing it. She kept her consulting work. She kept her Tuesdays and her Thursdays and her first Fridays. She kept her own accounts. And when she did put her expertise into the firm, because she found she wanted to, not out of obligation but out of genuine interest in the thing they could build together if they were actually building it together, she was named. She was in the room. Her calls were her calls, and her networks were her networks, and the things she made possible were no longer mistaken for the natural order of things. She sent Raymond the dinner reservation in April. She put both their names on it. It was, she thought, a reasonable place to begin.